Ezra Stoltzfus stood at his kitchen window, watching sheets of rain slash across his farmland like God's own tears. Lighting split the darkened sky, illuminating his fields of corn that swayed violently in the wind. At 45, Ezra had weathered many storms, but something about this one felt different, more personal, more urgent. "Papa, the barn." His 12-year-old son Samuel's voice cracked with concern as he pressed his face against the glass beside his father. Ezra's weathered hands tightened on the windowsill. The barn, his grandfather's barn, built in 1874, groaned under the assault of wind and rain. The structure had stood for nearly 150 years, sheltering 3 generations of Stoltzfus livestock and harvests. Its red paint had long since faded to a rustic brown, and its wooden beams bore the honest scars of time and labor. "It'll hold, Samuel," Ezra said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "That barn has seen worse." But even as he spoke, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, rattling the simple wooden furniture and causing his wife Rebecca to look up from her evening mending. Their other children, 16-year-old Mary, 10-year-old Jacob, and 8-year-old Sarah, gathered around the window, their faces reflecting the lightning's intermittent glow. Rebecca set down her needle and thread, smoothing her plain dark dress as she approached. At 42, she still moved with the quiet grace that had first caught Ezra's eye at a church, singing when they were both teenagers. Her prayer cap was perfectly positioned over brown hair that had begun showing threads of silver. "Perhaps we should check on the animals," she suggested, her voice calm but tinged with the practical concern of a farmer's wife. Ezra nodded, already reaching for his black coat hanging by the door. "Samuel, fetch the lantern. Jacob, you stay here with your mother and sisters." "But Papa." Jacob's protest was windle but earnest. "No argument, son. This storm means business." As Ezra and Samuel stepped onto the covered porch, the wind immediately tried to tear the breath from their lungs. The rain came at them sideways, soaking through their clothes within seconds. The lantern's flame danced wildly behind its glass protection as they made their way across the muddy yard toward the barn. The familiar path seemed treacherous now, with puddles reflecting the chaotic sky and loose branches scattered everywhere. Ezra's boots, worn smooth by decades of farm work, slipped on the wet stones, but his steady gait never faltered. This land was in his bones, every root, every rock, every gentle rise and dip of the earth. They reached the barn just as another bolt of lightning illuminated the countryside. In that brief, stark moment, Ezra saw something that made his heart skip. One of the barn's support posts was tilting at an angle that shouldn't be possible. "Samuel, stay close," he called over the wind. Inside the barn, their horse Duchess nickered nervously, and the 3 milk cows shifted restlessly in their stalls. The familiar smells of hay and animals were somehow comforting, even amid the chaos outside. But as Ezra raised the lantern higher, scanning the rafters for damage, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Creaking. Not the normal settling sounds of old wood, but something deeper, more ominous. The sound seemed to come from beneath their feet. "Papa, look," Samuel whispered, pointing to the far corner of the barn, where the tilted support post met the floor. The wooden planks had shifted, creating a gap that hadn't been there that morning. Dark earth showed through the opening, and as they watched, another flash of lightning revealed something that made Ezra's breath catch in his throat. The gap wasn't just showing soil, it was showing empty space, a hollow darkness that seemed to go down much deeper than it should. "What is it, Papa?" Samuel's voice was barely audible above the storm. Ezra approached slowly, the lantern held steady in his calloused hands. He had lived on this land his entire life, had helped his father repair this very barn countless times, knew every inch of its foundation. There should be nothing but packed earth and stone beneath these floorboards. But as he knelt beside the gap and lowered the lantern, the light revealed something impossible. Steps. Rough-hewn stone steps leading down into darkness. The storm raged on above them, But in that moment, surrounded by the familiar warmth of the barn, Ezra Stoltzfus stared into a mystery that would change everything he thought he knew about his simple Amish life. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that some secrets once unearthed can never be buried again. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and glistening with dewdrops that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. But Ezra had barely slept. All night, the image of those stone steps had haunted him, their rough surfaces worn smooth by age, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow his lantern's light. He stood in his kitchen, cradling a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hands, staring out at the barn. Rebecca moved quietly around him, preparing breakfast for the children, but he could feel her worried glances. In 23 years of marriage, she had learned to read his moods like the sky before weather. "You're troubled," she said simply, not looking up from the cast-iron skillet where eggs sizzled and popped. "The barn needs repair," Ezra replied, which was true but not the whole truth. How could he explain what he'd seen? How could he tell his devout wife that their land, blessed and worked by 3 generations of faithful Amish farmers, might be hiding secrets? The children clattered down the wooden stairs, their voices bright with the energy of a new day. Mary, at 16, had begun helping more with the household duties, her movements mirroring her mother's practiced efficiency. Samuel still buzzed with excitement from the previous night's adventure, though he'd been sworn to temporary silence about their discovery. Jacob and little Sarah chatted about the storm damage they might find outside. "Can we help fix the barn, Papa?" Jacob asked, his 10-year-old eyes shining with eagerness. "We'll see what needs doing first," Ezra said, ruffling his son's dark hair. "Samuel, you'll come with me to assess the damage. The rest of you have chores." After breakfast, Ezra and Samuel walked across the yard to the barn. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed free of humidity by the storm. Birds sang in the maple trees that bordered their property, and the normal rhythm of farm life seemed to beckon. Feed the animals, milk the cows, check the crops. But Ezra's steps carried him inexorably toward the mystery that had stolen his sleep. Inside the barn, everything looked different in daylight. The animals were calm now, Duchess whinnying Hothty and greeting. The tilted support post seemed less dramatic, more manageable. But there, in the corner where the floorboards had shifted, the gap remained, a dark mouth in the familiar wooden floor. "Papa," Samuel whispered. "It's still there." Ezra nodded, kneeling beside the opening. In daylight, he could see more detail. The stone steps were clearly very old, crafted with the kind of careful stonework that spoke of permanence, of intention. Someone had built this passage to last, but who and why? He thought of his grandfather, Heinrich Stoltzfus, who had built this barn, a quiet man who spoke little of the past, who had seemed to carry some weight on his shoulders that he never shared. Heinrich had died when Ezra was only 12, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave in the Amish cemetery on Miller's Ridge. "We need more light," Ezra said finally. "And rope." "Rope?" Samuel's voice cracked with nervous excitement. "Someone needs to go down there, son. Those steps were built for walking." An hour later, Ezra had gathered what he needed: a stronger lantern, 50 feet of hemp rope, a small shovel, and his grandfather's old leather satchel. He'd told Rebecca he was inspecting storm damage, which was technically true. He hadn't mentioned that the damage might lead to something far more significant than broken boards. Standing at the edge of the opening, Ezra tied one end of the rope securely to the barn's central support beam. The other end he wrapped around his waist. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the stone steps, and he could feel the cool, musty air rising from below. "Papa, maybe we should tell Mama," Samuel said, his earlier excitement now tempered with genuine concern. Ezra paused. His son was right to be cautious. It was how they'd been raised, how the Amish approached all things: community decisions, careful consideration, prayer before action. But something deep inside him, some instinct he didn't fully understand, told him this discovery was meant for him alone. at least for now. "I'll just go down a few steps," he promised. "See what's there. If it's dangerous, we'll fill it in and never speak of it again." But even as he spoke the words, Ezra knew he was lying to himself. Whatever lay beneath his barn, he was going to explore it fully. The pull was too strong, the mystery too compelling. He placed his boot on the first stone step. It held firm, worn smooth but solid. The second step, then the third. The walls closed in around him, not uncomfortably, but definitively. This was a passage meant for single-file travel, carved through earth and stone with remarkable precision. "Papa?" Samuel's voice drifted down from above, already sounding distant. "I'm fine," Ezra called back, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "The steps are solid. 10 steps down, then 15. The barn's familiar sounds faded, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. The air grew cooler and carried scents he couldn't identify, not the rich earth smell of good farmland, but something older, more complex. 20 steps, 25. How deep did this passage go? The walls around him were no longer rough earth, but fitted stone, the work of master craftsmen. Whoever had built this had possessed both skill and resources, far beyond what he would have expected from 19th-century farmers. At 30 steps, the passage leveled out into what appeared to be a small chamber. Ezra raised his lantern higher and gasped. The chamber was perhaps 10 feet square, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. But it wasn't empty. Along the walls, carefully arranged on stone shelves, were objects that made no sense in the context of his simple Amish world. Books, dozens of them, wrapped in oiled cloth, metal objects that caught the lantern light. What appeared to be maps or documents in wooden boxes, and in the center of the chamber, a wooden table bearing a leather journal opened as if someone had just been reading it. Ezra approached the table on trembling legs. The journal's pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was still clearly legible in his lantern's glow. At the top of the open page, in careful handwriting, were the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life: "Property of the Underground Railroad Station, Stoltzfus Farm. May God forgive us for the secrets we must keep, and may He bless those we help toward freedom." The date beneath was July 15th, 1858. Ezra's grandfather's name was signed at the bottom of the page. The lantern trembled in his hands as the full weight of the discovery crashed over him. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a piece of American history, a testament to courage and compassion that had been buried beneath his family's land for over 150 years. His grandfather hadn't just been a simple Amish farmer. He had been part of the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people escape to freedom. And Ezra had never known. "Papa," Samuel's voice echoed down the passage, tight with worry. "Papa, are you all right?" Ezra tried to answer, but no sound came. He was staring at a page that detailed the successful passage of a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, who had sheltered in this very chamber for 3 days before continuing north to Canada. The entry was written in his grandfather's careful German script, translated now by eyes that had learned to read English in school, but still understood the old language of his ancestors. His hands shook as he turned the page. More entries, more families, more lives saved by the quiet courage of a man Ezra had thought he knew. The journal chronicled 3 years of Underground Railroad activity from 8. Dozens of people had found safety here, hidden beneath the barn, where Ezra now stored hay and sheltered livestock. "Papa," Samuel's voice was more urgent now. I'm coming up," Ezra managed to call, his voice hoarse with emotion. But his eyes remained fixed on the journal, on a world of secrets and sacrifice that had existed right beneath his feet for his entire life. One entry near the end of the journal made him pause. It was dated September 3rd, 1859, and the handwriting was different, shakier, as if written in great haste or under extreme stress. "They came looking today," it read. "Questions about missing property. We cannot continue. Too dangerous for the community. May God forgive us, but we must close this station. I pray the sacrifices we have made were worth the lives we have saved. The tunnel must be sealed. Let this record remain as testimony to what was done here in the name of compassion. Ezra realized he was holding his breath. The last entry was signed not with his grandfather's name, but with another signature that made his heart skip a beat. Rebecca Fisher Stoltzfus. His grandmother, a woman he had never known, who had died giving birth to his father. She too had been part of this hidden world of courage and sacrifice. The implications crashed over him like a tide. His grandparents hadn't just been passive participants in the Underground Railroad. They had been station masters, risking everything to help others find freedom. The conservative Amish community he had always known, with its emphasis on pacifism and separation from the world's conflicts, had harbored heroes who defied unjust laws in service of a higher moral calling. Samuel's voice came again from above, edged with real fear now. Ezra knew he had to return to the surface, to his son, to his regular life. But as he turned to leave the chamber, his lantern light caught something else. A small wooden box on one of the stone shelves, partially hidden behind the wrapped books. Against his better judgment, he crossed to examine it. The box was simple, but well-crafted, about the size of a loaf of bread. When he lifted the lid, his breath caught once more. Inside, nestled in faded blue cloth, was a collection of items that told their own story. A child's wooden doll carved with loving care, a woman's simple gold wedding ring, a man's pocket knife with initials carved in the handle, and at the bottom, a folded piece of paper that, when opened, revealed itself to be a map of Pennsylvania with a route marked in pencil, the path to freedom that had run through this very chamber. These weren't just historical artifacts. These were personal treasures, left behind by people fleeing slavery, possibly never reclaimed because their owners had been caught, or had decided the risk of return was too great. Each item represented a human story, a family torn apart and seeking reunion, a life disrupted in the pursuit of the most basic human right, freedom. Ezra carefully refolded the map and replaced the items in their cloth nest. The weight of what he had discovered was becoming overwhelming. This wasn't just his family's secret history. It was American history, a piece of the great moral struggle that had torn the country apart and ultimately led to civil war. "Papa, please," Samuel's voice cracked with desperation. "Coming," Ezra called back, finally breaking free from his trance. He closed the journal, noting the page number so he could return to it, and reluctantly turned toward the passage that led back to his normal world. But as he climbed the stone steps, his mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Why had his grandfather sealed this chamber? What had happened to make him stop the Underground Railroad activity? And most importantly, what was Ezra supposed to do with this knowledge now? By the time he emerged into the barn's familiar warmth, blinking in the relative brightness, Samuel was pacing near the opening like a caged animal. "Papa, I thought I was scared." The 12-year-old's voice broke, and Ezra realized he had been down there much longer than he'd intended. The sun had moved considerably across the sky. "I'm sorry, son," Ezra said, untying the rope from around his waist. "I found there's more down there than I expected." "What kind of more?" Samuel asked, his fear giving way to curiosity. Ezra looked at his son, really looked at his son, really looked at him. Samuel had his grandfather Heinrich's steady eyes, his great-grandfather's strong jaw. This boy was part of a legacy of quiet heroism that he didn't even know existed. How could Ezra begin to explain what he had discovered? How could he help his son understand that their family's simple Amish history was far more complex and courageous than any of them had ever imagined? "Sit down, Samuel," Ezra said finally. "We need to talk about what it means to keep secrets, and about what it means to do the right thing even when it's dangerous." As his son settled cross-legged on the barn floor, Ezra began the most difficult conversation of his parenting life. trying to explain how the past could reach across 150 years to change everything they thought they knew about themselves, their family, and their faith. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the barn's windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. But inside Ezra's heart, a storm was brewing that would prove far more powerful than the weather that had revealed his family's buried secret. He didn't know it yet, but his life as a simple Amish farmer was over. The tunnel beneath his barn had not just led to a hidden chamber, it had opened a doorway to questions about identity, faith, and moral courage that would transform him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The conversation with Samuel lasted until the shadows grew long across the barn floor. Ezra found himself struggling to explain concepts that his own mind was still grappling with, how his peaceful grandfather could have defied laws, how their quiet faith could have compelled acts of rebellion, how love for strangers could override fear of consequence. Samuel listened with the intense focus that children reserve for stories that reshape their understanding of the world. His 12-year-old mind wrestled with the same contradictions that were tearing at Ezra's heart. "But Papa," Samuel said finally, "if great-grandfather was helping people escape, wasn't he breaking the law?" It was the question Ezra had been dreading, because it cut to the very center of Amish beliefs about authority and submission to worldly powers. The Amish were taught to be separate from the world's conflicts, to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's, to turn the other cheek rather than resist. Sometimes, Ezra said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man walking across thin ice, there are laws made by men that go against God's laws. When someone is enslaved, when families are torn apart, when human beings are bought and sold like cattle. He paused, seeing his own moral awakening reflected in his son's wide eyes. Sometimes love requires us to risk everything, even if the elders wouldn't approve. Samuel's question was barely above a whisper. Ezra's heart clenched. His son had identified the thorniest issue of all. The Amish community in Lancaster County was led by bishops and ministers who valued order, tradition, and separation from worldly affairs above almost everything else. The idea that members of their community had once been active participants in political resistance would be shocking, possibly even threatening to their way of life. "That's what we need to figure out," Ezra said. "What this discovery means for us, for our family, for our community." They sealed the chamber opening temporarily with loose boards, agreeing to tell no one else about their discovery until they could decide what to do. But as they walked back toward the house for evening chores, Ezra felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him like a physical burden. Rebecca noticed immediately. At the dinner table, as they bowed their heads for silent grace, Ezra found himself unable to focus on gratitude for their simple meal. Instead, his mind kept returning to that leather journal, to the careful records of courage and compassion hidden beneath their feet for 50 years. "You've barely touched your food," Rebecca observed, as the children chatted about their day. Her voice carried the gentle concern of a woman who had learned to read her husband's moods like weather patterns. "Just tired from the storm repairs," Ezra replied, but he could see in her eyes that she wasn't convinced. That night, after the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Ezra sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window toward the barn. Rebecca brushed her long brown hair in the mirror, a nightly ritual he had watched with pleasure for over 2 decades. But tonight, even this familiar comfort felt distant. "Ezra," she said softly, setting down her brush and turning to face him, "in all our years together, I've never seen you carry a burden like this. What did you find in that barn?" He looked at his wife, really looked at her. Rebecca had always been his anchor, his counselor, his partner in every decision that mattered. They had built their life together on honesty, on shared faith, on the kind of trust that could weather any storm. How could he keep this secret from her? But how could he share it? The implications were too vast, too potentially destructive to their peaceful life. "Something that changes everything I thought I knew about my family," he said finally. Rebecca moved to sit beside him on the bed, her hand finding him. "Then perhaps it's time you knew the truth about mine as well." Ezra turned to stare at her, his heart suddenly racing. "What do you mean?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the simple quilt that covered their bed. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets long held. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," she said. "Stories about the old days, about why our families came to Lancaster County, about things that happened before the war. I thought they were just stories, tales to entertain a child. But after we married, after I learned more about your grandfather Heinrich," she paused, meeting his eyes, "I began to wonder if they might be true." "What kind of stories?" Ezra's voice was hoarse. "About houses with hidden rooms, about families who disappeared in the night and were never spoken of again, about why certain families left the community suddenly, without explanation." Rebecca's hand tightened on him. "About people who helped runaway slaves, even though it went against everything we were taught about staying separate from the world's conflicts." Ezra felt the room spinning around him. "Your grandmother knew?" She said the women always knew. They had to know. They were the ones who prepared the food, who tended the injured, who comforted the children who cried in the night from fear and exhaustion. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She said it was the women who bore the real burden of the secrets, because they had to keep acting normal while their hearts were breaking for the suffering they witnessed. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I thought they were just stories," Rebecca whispered. "And because I was afraid of what it might mean if they were true." Ezra stood up abruptly, beginning to pace their small bedroom. The walls seemed to be closing in on him. "They were true. All of it. There's a chamber under our barn, Rebecca's, a fully equipped underground railroad station, with records going back to the 1850s. My grandfather wasn't just involved. He was running it. And my grandmother," his voice broke. "My grandmother, who I never knew, who died giving birth to my father. She was part of it too." Rebecca rose and went to him, her arms encircling his waist from behind. He could feel her tears soaking through his shirt. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. It was the question that had been haunting him all day. What were they going to do with this knowledge? How could they reconcile the heroes they had discovered in their family history with the quiet, submissive faith they had been raised to practice? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we can't pretend we never found it." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other while the weight of their ancestors' secrets settled around them like a mantle they had never asked to wear. The next morning brought no easy answers, only more complications. At breakfast, Mary announced that several families from their church district would be coming for a barn raising the following week to help repair the storm damage. "Bishop Yoder suggested it," Mary said, buttering her toast with the efficiency of a girl raised to household responsibility. "He said the whole community should help, since your barn is one of the oldest in the district." Ezra nearly choked on his coffee. Bishop Yoder, a stern man in his 70s who regarded any deviation from traditional ways as a potential threat to their community's spiritual purity. The thought of the bishop and dozens of church members crawling all over his barn, potentially discovering the hidden chamber, made Ezra's blood run cold. "When exactly?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Next Saturday. The men will work on the structural repairs while the women prepare the meal." Mary looked pleased to be sharing such pleasant news. "It'll be like the old days, when the whole community came together for big projects." After breakfast, as the children scattered to their morning chores, Rebecca and Ezra found themselves alone in the kitchen. The weight of their shared secret seemed to fill the room. "We have 6 days, Rebecca said quietly. "To do what? Fill in the chamber? Destroy 150 years of history?" "To decide what kind of people we are," Rebecca replied. "What kind of parents we want to be. What kind of legacy we want to leave our children." Ezra stared out the window toward the barn. Samuel was already beginning his morning chore. His son moved with the same steady purpose that had characterized 3 generations of Stoltzfus men. But now Ezra wondered what other traits had been passed down through their bloodline. What capacity for courage, What willingness to risk everything for the sake of others. "I need to go back down there," he said. "I need to read more of that journal, understand what really happened. Then I'm going with you." Ezra turned to look at his wife. Rebecca stood straight and determined, her chin set in the way he recognized from their early courtship days when she had faced down his father's initial disapproval of their match. "Rebecca, it's dangerous. The passage is narrow, the chamber is underground. My grandmother's stories mentioned that chamber," she said firmly. "If there are answers down there about our families, about our history, then I have as much right to see them as you do." An hour later they stood together at the entrance to the tunnel, both carrying lanterns. Ezra had reinforced the rope and brought additional supplies, including a canvas bag for any documents or artifacts they might want to examine more closely above ground. The descent was easier the second time, though Ezra's heart still raced as they made their way down the worn stone steps. Rebecca moved carefully but without fear, her practical nature adapting quickly to the unusual circumstances. When they reached the chamber, Rebecca gasped, just as Ezra had the day before. But her reaction was different. Instead of shock, her face showed a kind of recognition, as if the room matched descriptions from childhood stories she had almost forgotten. "It's exactly as she said," Rebecca whispered. "The stone shelves, the wooden table, even the way the chamber is shaped." She moved to examine the wrapped books, while Ezra returned to the journal. Reading by lantern light, Ezra began to piece together a more complete picture of his grandparents' activities. The Underground Railroad station had operated for 3 intense years, helping an estimated 47 people reach freedom. The risks had been enormous, not just legal consequences, but the threat of violence from slave catchers and the possibility of bringing danger to the entire Amish community. But it was Rebecca who made the discovery that changed everything. "Ezra," she called from across the chamber, her voice strange. "You need to see this." She was standing before one of the stone shelves, holding a wooden box he hadn't noticed the day before. Unlike the other artifacts, this box was clearly marked with names and dates carved into its lid. "What is it?" he asked, moving to her side. "A record box," she said. "Look at the names." Ezra held his lantern closer to the carved lid. There, in careful lettering, were family names from their community, names he recognized, names that belonged to respected Amish families who still lived in Lancaster County. "Yoda," he read aloud. "Byler. King. Fisher." He looked up at Rebecca with growing amazement. "These are all families from our district." "Not just our district," Rebecca said, opening the box to reveal a collection of small wooden tokens, each carved with initials and dates. "These are families who participated in the Underground Railroad. The tokens were probably used to identify safe houses and trusted helpers." Ezra picked up one of the tokens. "JY 157. He looked at Rebecca. "John Yoder, Bishop Yoder's grandfather," Rebecca confirmed. "And look at this one. That would be Emmanuel Byler, whose grandson runs the furniture shop in town." They spent the next hour examining the tokens and cross-referencing them with the journal entries. A pattern emerged that was both inspiring and terrifying. The Underground Railroad operation in their area hadn't been the work of a few rogue individuals. It had been a community effort involving multiple Amish families, coordinated and sustained over years. The implications were staggering. The quiet, law-abiding Amish community that Ezra had known all his life had once been home to a network of resistance fighters who had risked everything to fight injustice. Their ancestors hadn't just been passive observers of the great moral struggle of their time. They had been active participants on the side of freedom and human dignity, but they had also been keepers of secrets so profound that the truth had been buried for 150 years. What happened? Ezra wondered aloud. Why did it stop? Why did they seal the chamber? Rebecca had found another journal, smaller than the first, wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of the record box. As she opened it, her face grew pale in the lantern light. September 1859. A family of 6 arrived 3 days ago. The Washingtons, parents and 4 children, including a baby. They had been traveling for 2 weeks, following the route we had established. But something went wrong. She paused, her voice catching. Slave catchers followed them. They knew about our network. Someone had talked. Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. What happened to the family? Rebecca continued reading, her voice barely above a whisper. The catchers came at dawn. They had warrants, legal authority to search property. The Washingtons were hidden in the chamber. But she stopped, unable to continue. But what? Ezra prompted gently. But the baby started crying. The sound carried up through the floorboards. Rebecca looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. They were discovered, all of them, the parents, the children, even the baby. They were taken back into slavery. The weight of this tragedy settled over them like a shroud. Ezra could imagine the scene, the terror of the hidden family, the helplessness of his grandparents, the devastating knowledge that their efforts to save lives had instead led to capture and probably worse punishment for the people they had tried to help. "Is that why they stopped?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, still reading. "Your grandfather writes that the risk had become too great. Other families in the network were being watched. There were threats of violence against anyone caught helping runaways, and the guilt," she paused, "the guilt of what happened to the Washington family was destroying him." Ezra sank onto the wooden chair beside the table, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions washing over him. Pride in his ancestors' courage, grief for the family that had been betrayed by their own cries for help, fear about what this knowledge meant for his own family's future. "There's more," Rebecca said softly. A final entry, written in different handwriting. She read aloud, "Henrik cannot bear to continue. The chamber will be sealed today. We pray that someday when the world is different, when slavery is ended and justice prevails, someone will find this record and understand what we tried to do here. We pray they will forgive us for our failures and remember that we acted out of love, even when love was not enough." The signature at the bottom was Rebecca Fisher Stoltzfus, Ezra's grandmother, the woman he had never known but whose courage and compassion had shaped his family's destiny. They sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the weight of decisions that would affect their future. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "We can't keep this secret," she said, "not from our children, not from our community. This is part of who we are, part of where we came from. But if we reveal it," Ezra began, "if we reveal it, we honor their memory. We show that our faith has always been about more than just keeping rules. It's been about loving our neighbors as ourselves, even when that love requires sacrifice." Ezra looked around the chamber one more time, at the evidence of courage and compassion that had been hidden beneath his feet for his entire life. His grandparents had been heroes in the truest sense, not because they had succeeded in every rescue attempt, but because they had tried. They had risked everything for strangers, had opened their hearts and their home to people fleeing unimaginable oppression. And now it was his turn to decide what to do with their legacy. 6 days until the barn raising, he said. 6 days to decide what kind of people we want to be, Rebecca agreed. As they climbed back toward the surface, carrying with them copies of the most important journal entries and several of the carved tokens, Ezra felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. His simple life as an Amish farmer was becoming something far more complex, a bridge between past and future, between secret heroism and public accountability. He didn't know it yet, but the decision he was about to make would not only transform his own understanding of faith and courage, but would ripple out to affect his entire community, his children's future, and the way an entire generation of Amish families understood their own history. The tunnel beneath his barn had been more than a hiding place for runaway slaves. It had been a pathway to moral awakening that would challenge everything he thought he knew about what it meant to live a faithful life. The next 3 days passed in a blur of internal torment for Ezra. He went through the motions of farm life, milking cows, tending crops, repairing equipment, but his mind remained underground, wrestling with the implications of what he and Rebecca had discovered. Every time he looked at his children, he wondered what kind of legacy he was preparing to leave them. Every time he saw his neighbors at the feed store or the market, he wondered if their families too carried buried secrets of courage and resistance. On Wednesday evening, Bishop Yoder arrived unexpectedly at their door. Ezra's heart nearly stopped when he saw the elderly man's familiar black buggy pulling into their yard. Yoder was 73 years old, with a white beard that reached nearly to his chest, and eyes that seemed to see through to a person's soul. He had been the spiritual leader of their district for over 20 years, a man who valued tradition and order above all else. "Ezra," the bishop said as he climbed down from his buggy, his movements careful but determined. "I hope you don't mind an unannounced visit." "Of course not, Bishop," Ezra replied, though his mouth had gone dry. "Please, come in. Rebecca will have coffee ready." Inside the house, the family gathered respectfully as Bishop Yoder settled into their best chair. The children lined up quietly. Even little Sarah understood the gravity of a bishop's visit. Rebecca served coffee and fresh bread, with the gracious efficiency that was expected of an Amish wife. But Ezra noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she poured. "I wanted to speak with you about Saturday's barn raising," Bishop Yoder began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "There's been some talk in the community about the storm damage to your barn." Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. "What kind of talk?" Some of the men who helped clear debris mentioned irregularities in the foundation, gaps in the floorboards that seemed to go deeper than they should. The bishop's pale blue eyes fixed on Ezra's face. "I wanted to examine the damage myself before we begin the rebuilding." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Ezra felt as if the walls were closing in around him. In 3 days, dozens of community members would be crawling all over his barn. There was no way to hide the chamber's entrance during a full-scale construction project. "I see," Ezra said carefully. "When would you like to look?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you. I'd like to bring Jacob Byler as well. He's our most experienced builder, and his grandfather's barn was constructed around the same time as yours." Jacob Byler. Ezra's mind raced back to the token they had found with the initials EB. Emmanuel Byler, Jacob's great-grandfather, who had apparently been part of the Underground Railroad network. Did Jacob know about his family's history? Was this visit really about construction concerns, or was Bishop Yoder already suspicious about what might be hidden beneath the barn? After the bishop left, Ezra and Rebecca sat at their kitchen table, staring at each other across the simple wooden surface that had witnessed so many family discussions, so many shared decisions, but nothing had prepared them for this moment. "We're out of time," Rebecca said quietly. Ezra nodded. He knows something, or suspects something. "What are we going to do?" Before Ezra could answer, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his young face creased with worry. "Papa, is everything all right?" The bishop looked very serious. Ezra exchanged a glance with Rebecca. They had agreed to tell the children everything once they decided what to do with their discovery. But now, with Bishop Yoder's visit forcing their hand, there was no more time for careful planning. "Samuel," Ezra said, "please ask your sisters and brother to come to the kitchen. It's time we had a family meeting." 10 minutes later, all 4 children sat around the table, their faces reflecting curiosity and concern. Mary, at 16, had the composure of a young woman ready to hear adult truths. Samuel's eyes held the special knowledge of what he had already witnessed. Jacob and Sarah, at 10 and 8, simply waited with the patient trust that children place in their parents. "What I'm about to tell you," Ezra began, "is going to change how you think about our family, our history, and maybe even our faith. But it's important that you hear it from us before anyone else has a chance to twist the truth." He told them everything, about the storm revealing the tunnel, about the hidden chamber, about their great-grandparents' involvement in the Underground Railroad. Rebecca added details about her grandmother's stories, about the network of families who had risked everything to help enslaved people escape to freedom. The children listened in stunned silence. When Ezra finished, was the first to speak. "So our great-grandfather Heinrich was a hero," she said, her voice filled with pride and amazement. "Yes," Ezra said, "but he was also someone who broke the law, who went against the community's teachings about staying separate from worldly conflicts. Some people might see him as a troublemaker rather than a hero, but he saved people," Jacob said, his 10-year-old sense of justice cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "He helped families stay together." "That's exactly right," Rebecca said. "But the question we have to answer now is what we do with this knowledge." "We tell everyone," Sarah piped up, her 8-year-old enthusiasm making the adults smile despite their anxiety. "We tell them how brave great-grandfather was. It's not that simple, sweetheart," Ezra said gently. "Bishop Yoder and the other elders might not see it the way we do. They might think our family brought shame on the community by getting involved in politics and breaking the law." Samuel, who had been quietly processing everything, suddenly straightened in his chair. "Papa, you said the journal mentioned other families. What if Bishop Yoder's family was involved too?" Ezra felt his breath catch. Samuel had identified exactly what he and Rebecca had been wondering about. "That's possible, son, but we don't know for sure, and we can't just accuse people of things." "But if lots of families were involved," Mary said slowly, "then maybe it wasn't just a few people breaking the rules. Maybe it was the whole community deciding that some rules are wrong." From the mouths of babes, Ezra thought. His 16-year-old daughter had articulated something that he and Rebecca had been struggling to understand. What if the Underground Railroad activity hadn't been a betrayal of Amish values, but an expression of their deepest beliefs about love, compassion, and human dignity? That night, after the children were in bed, Ezra and Rebecca made their decision. They would tell Bishop Yoder the truth, all of it. They would show him the chamber, the journals, the tokens with familiar family names. They would trust that a man who had devoted his life to spiritual leadership would recognize the moral courage of their ancestors, even if it complicated his understanding of Amish history. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of autumn clarity that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Bishop Yoder arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, accompanied by Jacob Byler, a man in his 50s with the steady competence of someone who had spent his life working with his hands. "Good morning, Ezra," the bishop said as they approached the barn. "Jacob has some thoughts about the structural issues we might be facing." Jacob nodded respectfully. "I've been thinking about what the other men described. Gaps in foundation-level floorboards could indicate settling, but in a barn this old, built by Heinrich Stoltzfus, well, your grandfather was too good a craftsman for that kind of structural failure." Ezra's pulse quickened. Jacob's comment suggested more than casual knowledge about Heinrich's building skills. Was there recognition in the older man's eyes, some awareness of family history that went beyond construction techniques? "There's something I need to show you both," Ezra said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Something that was revealed by the storm damage. But first, I need to ask you both a question about family history." Bishop Yoder raised his eyebrows. "What kind of question? Do either of you know anything about your family's activities during the 1850s? Before the Civil War, the two older men exchanged glances, and Ezra saw something pass between them, a look of understanding that suggested his question wasn't entirely unexpected. "Why do you ask?" Bishop Yoder said carefully. Instead of answering directly, Ezra led them to the spot where the floorboards had shifted. He had prepared everything the night before, removed the temporary covering, set up lanterns, secured the rope. Now he knelt beside the opening and looked up at the two men who would determine his family's future. "Because I found evidence that our families weren't just neighbors in the 1850s, he said. They were partners in something that history would call heroic, but that our community might call quotable. He descended into the tunnel first, then called for the others to follow. Bishop Yoder came down slowly, his age making the stone steps treacherous, but his determination evident in every careful movement. Jacob followed with the sure-footed confidence of a man accustomed to construction sites and unfamiliar spaces. When they reached the chamber, both men stopped, as if they had walked into a wall of their own memories. "Man Gott," Bishop Yoder whispered in the old German that sometimes emerged in moments of deep emotion. "It's real." Jacob moved immediately to the wooden table where the journal lay open. "I always wondered," he said quietly. "My grandmother used to talk about secret rooms and mysterious visitors, but I thought," he trailed off, running his fingers over the careful handwriting. "These are records of Underground Railroad activity. Your great-grandfather Emmanuel's initials are on one of the identification tokens," Ezra said, "along with initials that might belong to Bishop Yoder's grandfather John." Bishop Yoder had been examining the stone shelves, but at Ezra's words he turned around slowly. His face showed not anger or disapproval, but something that looked almost like relief. "My grandfather left me something when I was ordained as bishop," he said. "A letter, sealed, with instructions that I should only open it if certain circumstances arose. He said I would know when the time was right." The old man's voice was thick with emotion. "I think that time has come." They spent the next 2 hours in the chamber, reading journal entries and examining artifacts, while Bishop Yoder shared details from his grandfather's letter. The picture that emerged was even more remarkable than Ezra had imagined. The Underground Railroad network in their area hadn't been the work of a few rogue families. It had been an organized effort involving the spiritual leadership of the entire Amish community. "My grandfather John was the coordinator," Bishop Yoder explained. "He worked with Heinrich and Emmanuel and several other families to establish routes, safe houses, and communication systems. They used their positions as respected community members to provide cover for the operation." "But why keep it secret for so long?" Jacob asked. "Why not celebrate this part of our history?" "Because," Bishop Yoder said sadly, "after the Washington family was captured, after the operation was exposed and shut down, there was tremendous pressure from outside authorities, government officials, slave catchers, even some other Amish communities criticized our district for getting involved in political conflicts. The decision was made to bury the truth, to present a unified front of peaceful non-resistance." "But that wasn't the truth," Ezra said. "No," the bishop agreed. "The truth was that our ancestors believed some moral imperatives transcend human laws. They believed that when government fails to protect the vulnerable, faithful people must step forward, regardless of the personal cost." Jacob had been reading through the journal entries, and suddenly he looked up with tears in his eyes. "Listen to this," he said, and read aloud. "Emmanuel brought news today that the Garrett family made it safely to Canada. 3 adults and 5 children, free at last. When I think of those children growing up in freedom, going to school, learning to read, having choices about their futures, when I think of that, every risk we take seems small in comparison." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hiss of the lanterns. Ezra looked around at the 3 other men, a bishop, a craftsman, and himself, a simple farmer, united in this underground space by the moral courage of their ancestors. "What do we do now?" he asked. Bishop Yoder was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the journal to the artifacts, to the faces of the 2 younger men. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of spiritual authority earned through decades of faithful service. "We tell the truth," he said, "not just to our own families, but to the entire community. Saturday's barn raising becomes something more than construction. It becomes a moment of historical reckoning, a chance for our community to reclaim a legacy of moral courage that we've kept buried too long." "But what if people don't understand?" Jacob asked. "What if they think our ancestors brought shame on the community?" "Then we help them understand," the bishop replied. "We show them that faith without works is dead, that love of neighbor isn't always convenient or safe, that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is risk everything for someone else's freedom. As they climbed back toward the surface, Ezra felt something shifting inside his chest, not the weight of secret knowledge, but the lightness of truth finally spoken. His grandfather Heinrich hadn't been a rule-breaker or a troublemaker. He had been a man whose faith compelled him to love his neighbor as himself, regardless of the color of that neighbor's skin or the legal status that society had imposed upon them. And now, 150 years later, Ezra had the chance to honor that legacy by refusing to keep it hidden any longer. Saturday's barn raising would indeed be more than a construction project. It would be a community's chance to rediscover the heroic dimensions of its own history, to understand that their tradition of peaceful living had always included the courage to resist injustice when resistance was required. But as they emerged into the bright autumn sunlight, Ezra knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Convincing an entire community to embrace a complex truth about their past would require all the wisdom, courage, and faith that 3 generations of Underground Railroad heroes had bequeathed to their descendants. The transformation that had begun with a storm was about to reach its climax in the most important conversation of Ezra's life. Saturday morning arrived with the golden light of perfect autumn weather. The maple trees surrounding the Stoltzfus farm blazed with red and orange, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. By 7 o'clock, buggies began arriving in Ezra's yard, carrying families from throughout their church district who had come to help rebuild the storm-damaged barn. Ezra stood on his front porch, watching his neighbors arrive, and felt his stomach churning with nervous anticipation. Today, these good people who had known his family for generations would learn that everything they thought they understood about their community's history was incomplete. Some would be inspired, others might be shocked, even angry. All would be changed. Rebecca appeared beside him, carrying a basket of fresh bread for the communal meal that would follow the work. She had been up since 4 o'clock, baking and preparing food alongside Mary, both of them channeling their nervous energy into the familiar rhythms of hospitality. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Ezra looked at his wife, the woman who had supported his decision to reveal the truth, who had shared the burden of discovery, who would stand beside him no matter what consequences might follow. "As ready as I'll ever be." The first hours of the morning proceeded according to the familiar pattern of Amish barn raisings. The men organized into work crews, examining the storm damage and planning the repair. The women set up tables under the shade of the maple trees, arranging food and organizing the children's activities. The younger generation moved between both groups, helping where needed and absorbing the community rhythms that would shape their own adult lives. Ezra worked alongside his neighbors, but part of his attention remained focused on Bishop Yoder, who was coordinating the overall project with his usual quiet authority. They had agreed that the revelation would come during the midday meal, when the entire community would be gathered together. But as the morning progressed, Ezra noticed several men examining the barn's foundation with unusual interest. Ezra called Daniel Miller, a man in his 40s who farmed the adjacent property. "This gap in your floorboards, it goes down much further than it should. Have you looked into it?" Several other men gathered around the opening, peering into the darkness below. Ezra's heart began to race. The moment of truth was arriving sooner than planned. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying across the worksite, "there's something down there that I think everyone should see, but perhaps we should wait until we're all together." Bishop Yoder looked up from the timber he was measuring. "If it affects the structural work we're doing, perhaps we should examine it now." There was no avoiding it. Ezra fetched lanterns while the work crews gathered around the opening. Women began drifting over from their food preparation, drawn by the unusual focus of attention. Children pressed closer, their curiosity overriding their usual instructions to stay out of the men's way during construction projects. "Before we go down there," Ezra said, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "I need to tell you all something about this barn, about our families, about our history, something that's been hidden for 150 years. The crowd fell silent. Even the children sensed the gravity of the moment and stopped their chatter. Ezra looked out at faces he had known his entire life. The Bylers, the Millers, the Kings, the Fishers, families whose names were carved on tokens in the hidden chamber below. Last week's storm revealed more than structural damage, he began. It revealed a secret that our ancestors kept buried because they thought it would protect our community. But secrets, I've learned, can sometimes do more harm than good. He told them about the tunnel, about the chamber, about the underground railroad station that had operated beneath their feet for 3 crucial years in the 1850s. As he spoke, he watched the faces in the crowd transform, surprise giving way to amazement, confusion evolving into understanding. My grandfather Heinrich wasn't the only one involved, Ezra continued. According to the records we found, dozens of families in our district participated in helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Your families, our community. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some voices sounded excited, others concerned. But Ezra noticed that several of the older members, those whose grandparents might have been alive during the Underground Railroad years, were nodding as if pieces of long-held puzzles were finally falling into place. "I want to see it," declared Miriam Byler, Jacob's wife, a woman known for her direct approach to complex situations. "If our ancestors were brave enough to risk everything for strangers, then we should be brave enough to honor their memory by learning the truth." Bishop Yoder stepped forward. "I agree," he said, "but the chamber is small and the passage is narrow. We'll need to go down in groups." For the next 2 hours, small groups of community members descended into the hidden chamber, emerging with faces full of wonder, pride, and questions. The journals were passed carefully from hand to hand, with those who could read German translating for others. The wooden tokens bearing family initials sparked recognition and sometimes tears as people connected their own names to this hidden legacy of courage. When everyone had seen the chamber, the community gathered under the maple trees for the meal that had originally been planned as a simple conclusion to a barn raising. But now it had become something far more significant, a moment of communal reckoning with their own history. Bishop Yoder stood to address the group, his white beard catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the autumn leaves. At 73 he had the authority of age and position, but his voice carried an unusual tremor as he spoke. "I have served as your bishop for 20 years, he began. "In all that time, I have tried to lead our community according to the principles of peace, simplicity, and separation from worldly conflicts that have defined Amish life for centuries. But today, I have learned something that changes my understanding of what those principles truly mean." He paused, looking out at the faces of people he had baptized, married, and counseled through decades of joy and sorrow. Our ancestors who participated in the Underground Railroad were not betraying our faith, they were fulfilling it. They understood that love of neighbor is not always convenient, not always safe, not always approved by worldly authority. They understood that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is risk everything for someone else's freedom. Sarah King, a young mother in her 20s, raised her hand tentatively. "But Bishop, we've always been taught to submit to government authority, to stay separate from political conflicts. How do we reconcile that with what our ancestors did?" It was the question that cut to the heart of Amish identity, the tension between peaceful submission and moral resistance that had challenged their community for generations. Bishop Yoder was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful theological consideration. "When government protects the vulnerable and upholds justice, we submit gladly. But when government fails in its most basic moral duty, when it allows human beings to be bought and sold like livestock, when it separates families and denies the God-given dignity of every person, then faithful people must follow a higher law." "But what about the consequence?" asked David Miller, Daniel's older brother, a man known for his cautious approach to change. "The records show that the Washington family was captured, returned to slavery. Our ancestors' resistance didn't always succeed." Ezra stood up, feeling compelled to address this concern that had haunted him since he first read about the Washington family's tragic fate. "I've thought about that every day since we found the journals," he said, "and I've realized that success isn't measured only by the outcomes we can see. The journals record 47 people who reached freedom because of our ancestors' courage. 47 lives changed, families reunited, children who grew up free instead of enslaved." He paused, looking around at his neighbors, these good people who were struggling with the same moral complexities that had challenged their ancestors. But even if they had saved only one person, even if they had saved no one, the attempt itself mattered, because faith without works is dead. Because love that doesn't risk anything isn't really love at all. Rebecca stood beside her husband, adding her voice to his. "My grandmother told me stories about the old days, about people who helped runaway slaves. I thought they were just stories until this week. But now I understand why she told them. She wanted us to remember that our faith has always been about more than just following rules. It's been about loving our neighbors as ourselves, even when that love requires sacrifice." The discussion continued for another hour, with community members sharing family stories that suddenly made new sense, asking questions about how this revelation should affect their understanding of their faith and their community's identity. Some were enthusiastic about embracing this heroic dimension of their history. Others remained cautious, concerned about the implications of celebrating ancestors who had broken laws and defied authority. But gradually a consensus began to emerge. This wasn't just ancient history. It was a living legacy that spoke to contemporary questions about how faithful people should respond to injustice in their own time. The Underground Railroad hadn't ended with the Civil War. It had evolved into other forms of moral courage that each generation had to discover for themselves. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the community timed the work of actually rebuilding the barn. But something fundamental had changed in the way they approached the task. Instead of simply restoring the structure to its original condition, they decided to create a small museum space in one corner, a place where the journals, tokens, and other artifacts could be preserved and displayed. "Our children need to know this story," declared Anna Fisher, a grandmother whose own great-grandfather's initials were on one of the wooden tokens. "They need to understand that faith sometimes requires us to take risks for others." Young Samuel Stoltzfus worked alongside his father, helping to install the new floorboards that would cover the tunnel entrance while preserving access for future generations. As they worked, Ezra realized that his son was witnessing something unprecedented in their community's recent history. A moment when buried truth had been excavated and embraced, rather than hidden again. "Papa," Samuel said as they fitted a specially designed section that could be lifted to reveal the chamber entrance, "do you think great-grandfather Heinrich would be proud of what we're doing?" Ezra paused in his work, considering the question. He thought about the man who had risked everything for strangers, who had carried the weight of moral courage and the burden of necessary secrets. "I think he would be amazed that his secret is finally being told," he said, "and I think he would be proud that his great-grandson had the courage to tell it." As evening approached and the barn raising neared completion, Bishop Yoder called the community together one final time. The new structure stood strong and straight, its fresh timber glowing golden in the setting sun. But more than a barn had been rebuilt today. An entire community's understanding of its own identity had been reconstructed around a more complete truth about their history. "We have learned today that our ancestors were heroes," the bishop said, "not because they were perfect, not because they always succeeded, but because they chose love over fear, compassion over comfort, moral courage over legal compliance. That is a legacy worth celebrating, worth preserving, worth living up to." He paused, looking out at the faces gathered in the twilight. "But knowing this history also creates responsibility. If our ancestors had the courage to risk everything for strangers, what courage might be required of us? What injustices in our own time call for the same kind of faithful resistance? What neighbors in our own community need the kind of love that our great-grandparents showed to people fleeing slavery?" The questions hung in the air as families began hitching their horses and loading their buggies for the journey home. But Ezra knew that these weren't questions that would be forgotten with the setting sun. They were questions that would be discussed around dinner tables, prayed about in private moments, carried forward into the decisions that would shape their community's future. As the last buggy disappeared down the lane, the Stoltzfus family stood together in their yard, looking at the barn that no longer held secrets, but instead bore witness to a legacy of moral courage. The structure looked the same from the outside, but everything about its meaning had been transformed. "What happens now?" Mary asked, echoing the question that all of them were pondering. Ezra put his arms around his children, drawing them close in the gathering darkness. "Now we live up to it," he said simply. "We honor their memory by having the same kind of courage in our own time, for our own neighbors, in whatever ways love requires." The barn stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, no longer hiding secrets, but proclaiming truths that would reshape a community's understanding of what it meant to live faithfully in a complicated world. And in the Stoltzfus farmhouse, a family that had discovered they were descendants of heroes went to sleep knowing that the most important part of their story was still being written. 3 months later, on a cold December evening when snow covered the Lancaster County countryside like a blessing, Ezra stood in his barn, looking at the small museum corner that had become a pilgrimage site for Amish families throughout Pennsylvania. Word of the Underground Railroad discovery had spread quietly through the network of Amish communities, drawing visitors who came to see the evidence that their shared faith had always included the courage to resist injustice. But tonight, the barn held a different kind of gathering. Ezra had called together his immediate family for a conversation that had been building in his heart since that transformative day in September. In his hands, he held a letter that had arrived that morning, a letter that would complete the circle of understanding that had begun with a storm. Rebecca sat on a hay bale beside their children, all of whom had grown and changed in the months since their family's secret had become their community's treasure. Mary, now 17, had begun corresponding with historians at nearby colleges who were documenting Underground Railroad activities. Samuel, 13 and taller by several inches, had become the unofficial tour guide for visitors to the barn museum. Jacob and Sarah, 11 and 9, had started a school project, collecting oral histories from elderly community members about family stories that might connect to the Underground Railroad years. "I received something today," Ezra began, his voice thick with emotion, "that I need to share with all of you, something that brings our story full circle." He unfolded the letter carefully. The return address showed Garrett University, Ohio, Office of Historical Research, but the handwriting was personal, intimate, clearly from someone who had been deeply moved to write. "Dear Mr. Stoltzfus," Ezra read aloud, "my name is Marcus Washington, and I am a professor of African American history at Garrett University. Through my research into Underground Railroad networks, I learned about your family's discovery and the museum you have created in your barn. I'm writing to you because I believe your family helped save mine." Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. The children leaned forward, their faces reflecting the gravity of what they were hearing. Ezra continued reading. "My great-great-grandfather was Thomas Washington. In 1859, he and his wife Elizabeth escaped from a plantation in Maryland with their 4 children, including my great-grandfather, who was only 6 years old at the time. Family stories passed down through generations told of a place of safety on an Amish farm in Pennsylvania, where they stayed for several days before continuing north to Canada." Ezra's voice began to shake. "According to your museum records, the Washington family was captured in September, but those records are incomplete. What they don't show is that my ancestors had been helped twice by Underground Railroad stations. The first time, they were indeed captured after staying at an Amish farm, but they escaped again 6 months later, and on their second attempt, they successfully reached Canada." "Oh my God," Rebecca whispered. "The Washington family, they made it. They survived." Ezra nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks, as he continued reading. My great-great-grandfather Thomas lived to be 91 years old. He became a teacher in Ontario, helping other escaped slaves learn to read and write. He named his school the Stoltzfus Institute in honor of the Amish family, who had risked everything to help them. The school operated for 40 years, educating hundreds of children whose parents had escaped slavery. The barn fell completely silent except for the soft sounds of Rebecca and Mary crying. Samuel had tears streaming down his young face, and even little Sarah seemed to understand that they were hearing something sacred. Dr. Washington wants to visit, Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wants to bring his family, his children and grandchildren, to see the place where their ancestors found safety. He wants to thank us, in person, for what our great-grandparents did. Jacob, now 11 and old enough to grasp the full significance of what they were hearing, spoke up through his tears. Papa, does this mean great-grandfather Heinrich wasn't a failure? That the people he tried to save actually made it? Ezra knelt down beside his son, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders. It means that love is never wasted, Jacob. Even when we can't see the results, even when things seem to go wrong, acts of courage and compassion ripple out through time in ways we never imagine. He looked around at his family, at these precious people who had been transformed along with him by the discovery that had started with a storm. Dr. Washington is coming in the spring. He wants to hold a memorial service here, not just for our ancestors, but for all the people who participated in the Underground Railroad. He wants to celebrate the courage of people who chose love over fear. Rebecca stood and moved to her husband's side, taking his work-worn hands in her. Henrik would be so proud, she said. He carried the burden of thinking he had failed, that the Washington family's capture was his fault. But love doesn't fail. Love just takes longer sometimes. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of preparation and correspondence. Washington proved to be a gentle, scholarly man in his 60s, whose great-great-grandfather's story had shaped his entire academic career. Through emails and phone calls, he shared details about the Washington family's life in Canada, about the school that had borne the Stoltzfus name, about the generations of freedom that had grown from the seeds planted in that hidden chamber beneath Ezra's barn. More importantly, Dr. Washington brought news of other families, descendants of people who had passed through various Underground Railroad stations throughout Pennsylvania. A network of contemporary families who carried the living legacy of that great moral movement, people who had been searching for ways to honor their ancestors' courage and sacrifice. The memorial service was planned for the first Saturday in May, timed to coincide with the anniversary of the Washington family's successful escape to Canada. Word spread throughout the Amish community and beyond, bringing together people who had never met but who shared a common heritage of moral courage. As spring arrived and the anniversary approached, Ezra found himself changing in ways he was still trying to understand. The simple farmer who had discovered a tunnel beneath his barn had become something else, a bridge between past and present, a keeper of stories that mattered, a man whose understanding of faith had been deepened and complicated by the discovery of his ancestors' heroism. On the morning of the memorial service, families began arriving before dawn. The Stoltzfus farm filled with people of all backgrounds, Amish families whose ancestors had participated in the Underground Railroad, African-American families whose ancestors had been helped by it, historians and students and community members who wanted to witness this unprecedented gathering. Dr. Marcus Washington arrived with his family in a small bus that carried 3 generations of descendants. When he stepped out and saw the barn where his great-great-grandfather had found safety, the dignified professor broke down and wept openly. His wife, his children, his grandchildren gathered around him as he struggled to find words for the emotion of standing on ground that had been sanctified by his family's suffering and survival. "I have dreamed of this place," he said when Ezra approached to welcome him. "My great-great-grandfather described it so many times, the red barn, the stone farmhouse, the kindness of people who spoke a different language but shared the same heart. He never forgot the courage of the family who risked everything for strangers." The memorial service began in the barn, with Bishop Yoder offering words of welcome that acknowledged the sacred nature of the ground they stood on. The hidden chamber had been opened for the occasion, and small groups descended to see the place where the Washington family and dozens of others had found refuge. But it was when Dr. Washington spoke that the true power of the moment became clear. Standing beside the entrance to the tunnel that had changed everything, he told the story of his family's journey from slavery to freedom, from fear to hope, from desperation to the dignity of lives lived in liberty. Thomas Washington lived to be 91, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. But even in his final years, he would tell his grandchildren about the Amish farmer who opened his barn to strangers, who shared his food with people he had never met, who risked his family's safety for the sake of human dignity. He said that farmer taught him what faith looked like when it was lived out in action. Dr. Washington paused, looking directly at Ezra. My great-great-grandfather always said that someday his descendants would come back to thank the Stoltzfus family. It took 65 years, but here I am. Here we are. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for being faithful. Thank you for proving that love is stronger than law, that compassion is more powerful than fear. The service continued with readings from the Underground Railroad journals, with songs that had been sung by fleeing slaves and their helpers, with prayers in multiple languages for the courage to continue the work of justice and compassion in their own time. But it was the final moment that broke open every heart present. Dr. Washington's 7-year-old granddaughter, a little girl named Freedom, named in honor of her ancestors' journey, had been quietly listening to the stories all day. As the formal service concluded, she approached Ezra with the serious demeanor that children sometimes adopt when they understand they are part of something momentous. Mr. Stoltzfus, she said in her clear young voice, my daddy told me that your great-grandfather helped my great-great-great-grandfather when he was running away from bad people. Ezra knelt down to her level, his heart already swelling with emotion. That's right, Freedom. He helped your family find a safe place to hide. The little girl nodded solemnly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. My great-great-great-grandfather made this, she said, carefully unwrapping a small wooden carving. He made it while he was hiding in your barn, and my family has kept it all this time. But Daddy says it should come home now. In her small hands was a wooden figure, a simple carving of a man, woman, and 2 children holding hands. The craftsmanship was rough, but filled with love, clearly the work of someone who had carved by lamplight during long hours of waiting and hoping. He made it to remember the people who helped his family, Freedom explained. And now I want you to have it, to remember that love keeps going even when people think it's broken. Ezra took the carving with trembling hands, and every person present, Amish farmers and university professors, elderly bishops and young children, descendants of slaves and descendants of their helpers, dissolved into tears. In that moment, the circle of love that had begun 65 years ago in a hidden chamber was finally, beautifully complete. As evening fell and the memorial service concluded, families began their journeys home, carrying with them a deeper understanding of what it meant to live faithfully in a complicated world. The Stoltzfus farm grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the silence of secrets kept, but the peace of truth finally told. That night, as Ezra and Rebecca tucked their children into bed, each child processing in their own way the day's overwhelming emotions, Samuel asked the question that was in all their hearts. Papa, do you think we'll ever do something as brave as great-grandfather Heinrich did? Ezra sat on the edge of his son's bed, holding the wooden carving that Thomas Washington had made during his desperate flight to freedom. The simple figures seemed to glow in the lamplight, testament to the enduring power of hope, even in the darkest circumstance. Samuel, he said softly, I used to think courage was something extraordinary, something that only heroes possessed. But this year I've learned that courage is really just love, that refuses to give up. Every time we choose kindness over indifference, every time we help someone who needs us, every time we stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, that's the same courage that our ancestors showed. He looked around at his children, Mary, who was already volunteering with refugee families in nearby cities. Samuel, who had started a school program to teach other children about the Underground Railroad. Jacob, who defended classmates who were being bullied. And little Sarah, who insisted on sharing her lunch with a girl whose family couldn't afford school meals. "You're already being brave," he said, his voice thick with pride and love. "Every day, in small ways and large ones, you're choosing love over fear. That's what great-grandfather Heinrich did. That's what we're called to do. That's how love keeps going, generation after generation." Later that night, Ezra and Rebecca sat on their front porch, looking out at the barn that had become a symbol of hope for people they had never met. The wooden carving sat between them on the porch rail, a bridge across time connecting their family to others who had shared the journey from desperation to freedom. "I keep thinking about that little girl," Rebecca said, "about how she said love keeps going even when people think it's broken." Ezra nodded, understanding exactly what his wife meant. For months he had struggled with the knowledge that the Washington family had been captured, that his grandfather's efforts had seemed to end in failure, but today they had learned that love doesn't end with capture, or with death, or even with the passage of centuries. Love continues, transforms, grows into new expressions of courage and compassion that reach across generations. "Henrik never knew," Ezra said quietly. "He never knew that the Washington family escaped again, that they made it to freedom, that they built a school and a life and a legacy. He carried the burden of thinking he had failed. But love doesn't require us to see the results," Rebecca replied. "It just requires us to be faithful, to do what's right regardless of the outcome." They sat in comfortable silence, these two people whose simple Amish life had been transformed by the discovery that their ancestors were heroes. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary routines of farm life, chores and meals and the countless small decisions that make up a faithful existence. But those routines would be infused now with a deeper understanding of what it meant to live courageously, to love neighbors as themselves, to trust that acts of compassion ripple out through time in ways they might never see. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, carrying in their hearts the stories that would shape their own understanding of faith and courage. They were the inheritors of a legacy that stretched back through generations of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things simply because love required it. And in the barn, beneath the floorboards that no longer hid secrets but proclaimed truths, the chamber stood as testimony to the enduring power of moral courage. The journals remained, recording acts of heroism that had been buried for hundreds. The tokens remained, bearing the names of families who had risked everything for strangers. The artifacts remained, physical proof that love is indeed stronger than law, that compassion is more powerful than fear. The storm that had revealed the tunnel was long past, but its effects continued to reverberate through the lives of everyone it had touched. Ezra Stoltzfus was no longer the same man who had stood at his kitchen window watching rain slash across his field. He had been transformed by the discovery that his simple life was connected to something magnificent, a legacy of moral courage that stretched across centuries and would continue into the future through the choices his children would make. As they finally went inside, Ezra took one last look at the barn silhouetted against the starlit sky. Tomorrow, the small museum would welcome more visitors, people searching for connections to their own family histories, students learning about the Underground Railroad, families like his own discovering that they were part of something larger and more beautiful than they had ever imagined. The tunnel beneath his barn had led to more than a hidden chamber. It had opened a pathway to understanding that would continue to transform lives for generations to come. Love, once released from its buried secrets, had proven to be unstoppable, flowing like an underground river from past to present to future, carrying with it the promise that every act of courage matters, every gesture of compassion counts, every choice to love rather than fear makes a difference that echoes through eternity. In the end, The Amish farmer who had found a tunnel under his barn had discovered something far more valuable than hidden artifacts or historical records. He had found his own heart expanded and transformed by the knowledge that he was part of a story much larger than himself, a story of ordinary people who had chosen to be extraordinary simply because love required it. And that discovery had changed him, just as the title promised, forever.